Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts' webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Long, TNC in Massachusetts' Director of Government Relations and your host today. We have an exciting program for you today. I'll be chatting with State Representative Jeffrey Roy, the House Chair of the Massachusetts Legislature's Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee, known as TUE. We'll talk about a path forward for offshore wind policy in Massachusetts and the region. But before we dive into today's program, I wanted to share a little bit about our guest. State Representative Jeffrey Roy was first elected to the Massachusetts House for the 10th Norfolk District in 2012, representing the residents of Franklin and Medway on Beacon Hill. He has been consistently reelected through 2020 and was appointed as the chairperson of the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee. He's also the House Chair of the Manufacturing Caucus, which promotes and encourages making it in Massachusetts. He's worked as an attorney since 1986 and operates a law firm, Roy Law, in Franklin, Massachusetts. And he has appeared in cases before state and federal courts throughout the US. He's also a member of the American Association for Justice and the Massachusetts Bar Association. Chair Roy will be doing a presentation for us on the development of offshore wind policy and legislation. As you think of questions for Chair Roy during his presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will provide them to the chairman. Before I start, I just want to say the Nature Conservancy greatly appreciates your leadership, Chair Roy, on climate and energy and offshore wind. Much like you, we support the deployment of renewables while maximizing generation and minimizing impacts on nature and people and fostering a green economy. We got really lucky with our timing, as just last week, the TUE committee released an offshore wind bill. So thanks again so much for joining us today. Are you ready to share your slide deck? And let's dive in. And just a reminder, audience questions in the Q&A, please.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for that kind introduction. I am delighted to talk to you today about Massachusetts and offshore wind. I will say, to begin, I was delighted when Speaker Mariano appointed me to this committee, knowing his commitment and all of the great work that he has done to support the development of offshore wind in Massachusetts. It was exciting to get that appointment, and that was February of 2021. And it was right after the inauguration of President Biden, who had made significant commitments to offshore wind industry. And you see that he had announced his national goal of 30 gigawatts along the East Coast by 2030. And to be positioned in this space in the middle of all these great announcements and the constellation of the stars, I was absolutely delighted. And 6 weeks into my job as the chair of the committee, you may recall that we passed the roadmap bill. Certainly we had made as a legislature a number of attempts. It had been sent back to us and vetoed and amended. But by March 26th of 2021, we had enacted the roadmap bill and the governor signed it into law. And specific to the wind piece, we raised the procurements up to 5,600 megawatts by 2027 and made a commitment of $12 million to offshore wind and other clean energy workforce development. And the key here is that 5,600 megawatts is enough wind to power as many as 2.8 million homes. And that's incredible, but that's just the beginning. Getting up to 30 gigawatts is a noble goal and one we will reach. And this wind is going to be key to us reaching our net zero goals by 2050. Next slide, please. This is the procurement schedule that we have established in Massachusetts. And, you know, the lease areas off the coast of Massachusetts, there are 7. Those represent opportunities for 11,000 megawatts of wind energy. In terms of gigawatts, it's 11 gigawatts. So that's 1/3 of what President Biden had suggested as the goal. So we first did the procurement for 800 megawatts, and that's the Vineyard Wind project. And you'll see later in the slides that's the first offshore wind project in the contiguous United States. And it's a big moment for the country, but it's also a big moment for Massachusetts because we are the first state to do a large scale offshore wind farm in the United States. Procurement number 2 was the Mayflower Wind project. It will get started as soon as Vineyard Wind is complete, and that's another 800 megawatts. In our most recent procurement, the bids were opened in December of 2021, and that's an additional 1,200 megawatts and for the Commonwealth project, which is Vineyard Wind, and then another 400 megawatts from a Mayflower Wind project, which totals 1,600 megawatts. So we have approximately 3,200 megawatts already procured and under contract in Massachusetts. Well, the third one is in contract negotiations right now, but we're confident we will get there. Next slide, please. So some of the exciting pieces for offshore wind in Massachusetts, you know, May 11th was a key date when the federal government approved the Vineyard Wind project. And you see some of the photographs from our wind blade test center over in Charlestown, where that announcement was made. And this first project, as I had indicated earlier, is going to start by powering about 400,000 homes. And to put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of taking 325,000 cars off the road. And our goal is to make Massachusetts a real regional hub for the offshore industry. And this contract alone is going to create 3,600 jobs, and that's real exciting for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The next slide will show you that on the heels of that announcement, on July 16, the nation's first offshore wind project labor agreement was announced, and that was down at the Mass CEC terminal in New Bedford. And as a result of the signing of that project labor agreement, we assured that 500 of the jobs in that first project are going to be union jobs. And that's another exciting step. And I think my announcement or my remarks at that event were a signal that I hope I get to go back to New Bedford on many occasions for announcements just like this. And that particular announcement brought out, Gina McCarthy from the White House, Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and a host of local and state officials and federal officials for what is a huge announcement, a big deal for the United States and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. And then on the heels of that, and on November 19th of 2021, we were at the groundbreaking for the nation's first large-scale offshore wind project. That was at Cowles Beach in Barnstable, and certainly does not look like a typical November day in New England. The temperature was, I believe, in the 60s that day. Incredible, but a great announcement for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Shovels are in the ground. That project is underway, and by the end of next year, you're going to see 62 turbines producing incredible amounts of energy. So the next slide, please. So when I was appointed by the Speaker, one of his first goals, and one of the things that he emphasized for me in my role as the House Chair, is he wanted me to take a deep dive on the offshore wind industry, and he wanted me to look at what lessons we had learned, what other states are doing, what other countries are doing, meet with industry representatives, meet with stakeholders, look into issues like workforce development, supply chain, transmission, procurement, and port infrastructure. And over the course of the next 6 months, I spent a great deal of time meeting with stakeholders and seeing what's out there on the landscape for offshore wind. And, we had meetings with, in this photograph, you see Secretary Moniz, who was talking to us about, the energy needs from his perspective. With the Obama administration, we saw actually this photo on the bottom left is me actually on the top of a nacelle doing repairs on a turbine. They're using virtual reality to train employees on what to do up on top of a nacelle. Incredible research and development going on in Massachusetts, but really informing on the work that we had to do. Next slide, please. We also, frequent trips down to New Bedford to meet with officials there, met with some UK officials. Bottom left is a photo with Peter Abbott. England's been doing offshore wind for 30 years, and he was only too helpful in saying, look, we made some mistakes along the way, learn from our mistakes, and we're happy to help you get it right here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And another interesting piece that we reviewed is up on the top right. That's the En-ROADS product that's a research product out of MIT, which shows what we need to do to meet our net zero goals of 2050 and what all the pieces of the puzzle, how they impact our ability to keep the Earth from warming, and some great technology, again, developed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Next slide, please. So as a result of all of this, this work, the next phase for me was the development of a state of offshore wind in Massachusetts report with recommendations. And we tried to analyze all issues at all levels, and the report ended up coming out at around 100 pages, single-spaced with graphs and charts. And I will admit that I was a bit nervous giving that over to the speaker, and I couldn't figure out a way to get it into one page, an executive summary. But I will tell you that Speaker Mariano was delighted to receive the report, delighted to read through it. And we had several conversations about where we needed to go next. And we embarked on a trip down to Block Island in Rhode Island to see a small scale offshore wind farm, get an up close and personal look at it, talk to some of the folks who developed this, get to see what some of the job opportunities were on an offshore wind farm. And that was a great place to begin to chart the course of where we were going to go in Massachusetts. And, the announcement was made, this is in September of 2021, that our next step was to develop a piece of legislation that puts Massachusetts at the top of the heap in the development of offshore wind. We can be a leader in the United States, and the Speaker of the House is committed to being a leader of the House. So that was our logical next step. Next slide. And in October of 2021, the governor made his own set of recommendations for things that he and his administration would like to see in an offshore wind proposal. We heard extensive testimony on that bill just last Wednesday, January 11th. I will note that there has been widespread industry support for our efforts in this area. And it was a very instructive hearing. I know they're all archived online. And if you want to see a great discussion of offshore wind and the potential for offshore wind, I'd urge you to take a peek at that particular hearing. And some of the provisions that the governor was looking for actually did end up in the piece of legislation that we did report out from our committee. And the next slide is the exciting piece of some of the lessons that we learned over the course of our research into the offshore wind industry. And I know we're going to go into this somewhat in depth after my presentation, so I won't go into the details at this point. Let's move on to the next slide, and let me give you some of the highlights from the legislation. It's an act advancing offshore wind and clean energy in Massachusetts, and one of the things that we did was to establish an offshore wind industry investment fund. And this is very similar to what we did in the legislature for the life sciences industry many years ago. And by focusing an investment fund and focusing state resources and working and developing a public-private partnership, we did wonders for the life sciences industry. And we wanted to replicate that for the offshore wind industry. Now, offshore wind, and I want to share with you some of the language that I included in the report to the speaker. I apologize for reading, but I think it's important that you hear this. Offshore wind is a large and growing source of energy around the world and is poised for rapid growth in the United States. The technology has improved dramatically, with larger turbines generating much more power and turbines successfully being put much farther from shore and in much deeper water. I already talked about the Biden administration's goal of generating 30 gigawatts of electricity from offshore wind. That's the equivalent of 30 coal-fired power plants, and that goal is by 2030. Now, central to this, Massachusetts is uniquely prepared to capitalize on the nation's emerging offshore wind industry and become the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. According to the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Massachusetts waters have the largest technical offshore wind potential of any state in the contiguous United States and has the technical potential to produce more than 1,000 terawatt hours of electricity from offshore wind. And as I had indicated earlier, we had already got underway 5,600 megawatts. So this is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime for any state, and Massachusetts is particularly poised. And we need to take advantage of that robust energy that is available off the coast of Massachusetts. We are not well known as a producer or a generator of energy in Massachusetts. We've been exporting energy from outside of the Commonwealth for so many years, but right off 14 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, we have an opportunity to begin producing clean and reliable energy that will power our needs as we look and search to achieve our goals of net zero by 2050. So that workforce in offshore wind and investment fund is key to that. It provides a certification program for offshore wind organizations, and we're going to have tax credits and loans and grants to help propel this industry. Grid modernization and planning is key to making all of this work. We're going to produce incredible amounts of energy, but getting it into the grid and getting it from those turbines into the plugs in our homes is a very complex process, and we need some grid modernization and planning. So we have included that within the legislation. Transmission is another piece that's critical, and we're looking to direct DOR to solicit some transmission proposals. We envision out in the ocean with hundreds of turbines, you could have a spider web of cables running underneath the ocean. And we think doing a coordinated transmission program, and we're encouraging the administration to do this on a regional basis, work with other states to provide transmission that's going to work. We're also looking at long duration energy storage, battery storage, other forms of storage, production of green hydrogen. These are pieces that are essential to making the wind industry work. The wind is going to blow at times when we may not need that energy. So we're going to need a way to store that energy so it's available to us when we need it. And finally, we have some education components in that bill, and one that I'll highlight for you now is a DESE pilot. That's Department of Elementary and Secondary Education pilot for offshore wind credential training. We're going to provide financial incentives to our high schools and other organizations to actually get young people engaged and interested in the offshore wind industry. This industry will bring thousands of jobs to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It will revolutionize some of the communities that have not taken or have not done well in other industries. And I highlight New Bedford in that context. And they've already begun with some training facilities at Bristol Community College, Mass Maritime, and UMass Dartmouth. And we want to move on and create some new opportunities, because the jobs that exist in this industry and that are going to be created have titles that we don't even know today. And we need to prepare a skilled workforce to get into these jobs that will be created. And I think that will give us a competitive advantage with other states in the area. Next slide, please. Some other areas, and I know we'll talk about this more in depth, is we looked at the price cap. Pricing has become very competitive in offshore wind. When we were first talking about this many years ago, it was in the 15 to 25 cent range for kilowatts. And as you may realize, the bids that came in are in the 5 and 6 cent range. But we haven't enjoyed as much economic development as we would want. So we are looking to relax and provide more flexibility on the price cap to encourage some economic development. We're changing the selection committee for the bidders. We've heard a lot from folks saying that the utilities shouldn't be involved in the selection process. We heard that, and we came up with a new team to evaluate these bids, and it's much more transparent and I think a fairer way to pick these bids. We are also looking at remuneration issues and asking that the bids maximize economic development. We're looking at environmental and fisheries plans and making some requirements that they provide interest in areas in the bids, such as fisheries mitigation, energy storage, interconnection, commitments allowing municipalities, business, or nonprofits to take some of the wind energy. We're also looking to get more project labor agreements, so that's part of the bids, and also what benefits would be available to our environmental justice community. So that's just an overview of what we have been doing at TUE on offshore wind, and I'm so excited that we have a Speaker of the House that views this as a major priority for his service as Speaker of the House, and I couldn't be more excited to be on his team to promote the development of a robust offshore wind industry. And I'm sure you folks at the Nature Conservatory are delighted that we're looking so strongly at clean and reliable forms of energy. So I'll stop there, and Steve, I look forward to our conversation together.
Fabulous. Thank you, Chairman Roy. I am so impressed with the level of due diligence that you and the TUE committee did to produce this legislation. Your report was fabulous.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. What I like is that you and the committee really focused on lessons learned. Massachusetts was the first state to move forward with a federally approved commercial scale wind project. So when you were doing the report, when you were crafting the legislation, we were talking with stakeholders, what have we learned through that process of bidding, selection, and siting that you then included in the legislation to improve things?
Well, I'll say two major things that we focused on were the price cap and economic development. We saw in the economic development space projects going to New York and New Jersey that we would have liked to have seen in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so we, part of that deep dive was to see what other states were doing. Now with the price cap, let me start with that. That was included in the 2016 Energy Diversity Act, and it was a good safety measure at the time to protect ratepayers. And I've said to folks who were part of that process in developing the price cap, I said that was a brilliant move at the time because, when you're dealing with real high prices, it's not very attractive to move forward. So that price cap was put in place to ensure that each successive offshore wind procurement would be less expensive than the previous procurement. And since 2016, I think you've seen great success in our offshore wind procurements. The first one came in at just over 6 cents a kilowatt, and then the second bids came in at 5.8 cents. And we're anxiously awaiting the prices for our third round of bidding, the price cap in place. I have to believe that it'll be 5.8 cents or less. But while that price cap has been great in keeping costs down, and it worked just fine, the bid prices have become so competitive that in our last round, Massachusetts only received 2 bids, and that was Vineyard Wind and Mayflower, who already had a footprint in Massachusetts. And we greatly wondered, where's Ørsted, where's Equinor, why are they not bidding? So we talked to them, and and I think price cap really came to the top as one of the impediments. So we wanted to provide a little bit more flexibility, and that led us to remove the price cap in the offshore wind bill that we just reported out of TUE, so that we could ensure that we were not going to stifle the process and competition with a very low ceiling price. And we wanted future bids to offer some economic value into the bids. And how do we attract economic value? So, we put some requirements in the legislation to require the bid selection committee to produce a numerical economic development score to evaluate these future bids. And the intent is to ensure that Massachusetts can attract valuable bids that will support economic development. At the hearing the other day, I think Secretary Theo Harides said it well. You can put out bids for a 3-lane bridge, but if a bid comes in with a 4th lane that presents some real value in how that bridge is used and the traffic it will alleviate, why not consider that as added value that we ought to look at? So those are some of the lessons learned. And I can tell you on the education piece, we looked at what other states were doing and really gained some value on the transmission piece that we put in the bill. We looked at what New Jersey was doing in terms of procurements for transmission. And so you'll see some similarities there, although we direct DOER to look at transmission on a regional basis, not just the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So long answer to a question, but I hope that helps.
Absolutely. And speaking of transmission, I really think it's smart to think about transmission on a regional scale where states in the Northeast are so densely packed. And we have so many lease areas off our coasts that it really makes sense to regionalize. And of course, our energy grid is organized on a New England scale. So I'm wondering if you could talk about one of the ways to consolidate things. And I thought I saw something in the bill about enabling a centralized transmission line. So there might be multiple offshore wind turbines or facilities sharing a transmission line. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and so I think that was the spider web I was talking about underneath all of these turbines, just overloading our current grid. And is there a way to consolidate all of these lines into a transmission line that works for everyone? And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, New England's a small area, it's small states. In my conversations with the consulate from England, Peter Abbott, England's been doing this offshore wind for over 30 years and has had some great success. And, he remarked at how it's easy for a country like England that's not broken up into little states to have collaboration and working together on these transmission issues. And he encouraged us to look at ways that we could get states to work together. And just prior to this discussion that I'm having with you, I was on a panel with NECEC, and we had folks from Maine and we had folks from New York on the call, and we were trying to address that issue. How do you get states to work together? The regionalization approach, you may recall, over the last few months, didn't really work out so well in the area of TCI. That collapsed.
The transportation, clean transportation program, yeah.
Right, and then the getting hydro from Quebec, which was a key piece to our roadmap goals, collapsed because of a vote by the state of Maine to not allow it to go through that state. Those certainly came up. So, regionalization is not easy. We're all individual states. I'm concerned about the citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I want Massachusetts to be the leader in this area. But I also recognize that climate change issues do not recognize any barriers. There are no borders for emissions, and the ocean doesn't have the similar borders. So it's a new mindset we have to bring to the table. And one of the pieces that we included in the bill was a more centralized and focused role for Mass CEC to be the key player in the offshore wind space in Massachusetts. And
CEC being the Clean Energy Center, the
Clean
quasi
Energy
authority. Yep.
Yes, having them have a centralized role in the hope that they can join forces with a group like NYSERDA in New York and perhaps some similar agencies in the other New England states, with the hope that they can get together and figure out a way to make regional efforts work. And there's a role here for the federal government as well.
I really like the way that regionalization can lead to fewer environmental impacts as well, rather than having multiple transmission lines landing in various places on shore. If you have one unified transmission line, it can help reduce those impacts. So it seems like there are many benefits to regionalization and consolidation.
Yep, absolutely.
Definitely. So I remember when the Energy Diversity Act was enacted back in 2016 that you referred to, that set up the first bidding process. And the selection process was then set with the utilities. The utilities made decisions. And that now you've changed that selection process for the winning bidders to an independent body. That seems like a major change. Who's on the body? What's their charge? And will there be more transparency so we can see how bids are scored and what the criteria are, and maybe lifting the lid off the process a little bit?
Well, I think having gone through 3 offshore wind procurements, there was widespread consensus that the utilities needed to be removed from their position as a decision maker for the winning offshore wind bids. And it addresses conflict of interest that arise when a utility participates. So I think that was easy to remove them. And I don't know that I've heard much in the way of objections to that. But the new selection committee would be chaired by the EEA Secretary, Environmental and Energy Affairs for Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we would also have the Economic Development and Housing Secretary, that's Secretary Keneally currently, would be on the panel. And that's a new shift. If you recall from the roadmap bill, we added the Housing and Economic Development Secretary into the process there because we wanted more emphasis on economic development. And I think you saw in our 3rd round of bids, there was some heavy economic development in that package. So that secretary would be on the panel. The independent evaluator that's selected jointly by DOER and the Attorney General's office would be on that. That's been a very successful addition to the committee. And then going to that piece on transparency, having an appointment from the House Speaker, an appointment by the Senate President. We did hear some pushback on that. So we made a notation that pick by the Speaker or the Senate President could not be a member of the Great and General Court. We didn't want any political pressure from any specific region of the Commonwealth to do it. And that, I think if you recall from any of you who watched hearing on last week, January 11th, when the governor was talking about his wind bill, there was an exchange with my Senate co-chair and the governor about the transparency of the process and how come the legislature doesn't see what's going on in these bids and to see if the provisions and the economic development that we're calling for are really having an impact. And I think these 2 particular picks will address that concern. And we think that this selection committee will provide a vastly improved transparency and accountability over what we have now, and because it removes the appearance or possibility of any conflict of interest. And we require that no selection committee member have a financial interest in any offshore wind bids. And we're trying to remove that opportunity for any undue influence in the process. And this committee builds on what we did in the next generation roadmap bill. I talked to you already about the Housing and Economic Development Secretary being on that. But these were some important changes, and I think they will be well received.
Absolutely. I was excited to see those myself and very supportive of those changes after the previous process. So being that we're the Nature Conservancy, we have a lot of questions from folks about the new environmental components in the legislation. How do wind developers avoid impacts on wildlife, on fisheries, on the seafood industry? And I really appreciated some of the changes that you all provided relative to avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts. Can you walk us through some of the changes that the committee made?
Certainly. And, I do want to offer some credit to the English consulate, Peter Abbott, who introduced me to a very robust fisheries mitigation plan that his country had developed in this process. So our bill has a number of environmental provisions that build on the efforts of offshore wind projects and codifies environmental safeguards that will ensure responsible development of offshore wind projects for all future projects. So it requires an environmental and fisheries plan for the construction and operation of offshore wind facilities. It requires that financial and technical assistance be provided to support robust monitoring of wildlife and habitat, and that's going to have to represent no less than 5% of a bid's overall score in a solicitation. So it's got to be taken seriously. It requires a preference to be given to offshore wind proposals that include avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of impacts to wildlife habitat and water-dependent uses. Requires the environmental and fisheries plan to include an explicit description of the best management practices and any mitigation the developer will employ for impacts to wildlife, coastal and marine habitats, natural resources, ecosystems, and traditional or existing water-dependent uses. It directs DOAR to establish an environmental working group and a fisheries working group to provide input on best practices, conduct ongoing review of monitoring and mitigation programs, and provide feedback and recommendations on an as-needed basis. And also requires DOER in consultation with the environmental and fisheries groups, so I'm sure they'll be reaching out to you, to determine how to use the funds submitted by developers to responsibly advance offshore wind. So those are some of the highlights.
That's great.
I thought you would like those.
Absolutely. And one of the things I really liked was the room for continuous improvement and adaptive management from those advisory boards, and also from the monitoring to help incorporate best management practices. I thought that was really clever.
Thank you.
Because it's not a static world out there. We're learning more and more about renewable energy and its impact on the environment and people. So having that adaptive management piece is really terrific.
Well, I can tell you, getting these provisions into the bill is a result of our commitment to meeting with groups, organizations, and individuals, and actually sitting at the table with them. Actually, over COVID, I have not been sitting at many tables. I've been sitting at tables like we're having right here. But
maybe the kitchen table.
The kitchen table, yeah. But having those stakeholder meetings was absolutely eye-opening. I learned a lot through the process. I tried to take all of that learning and compile it into the report that we prepared. But I really have to tip my hat to those folks who stepped up to the plate, sat with us, engaged with us, and provided us with the information we need. And I'm really proud of the team that we have here on the TUE staff. It's no secret that they are some of the best and brightest staff folks and researchers in the entire State House. And I got lucky to have all three of them on my team at once. And putting this all together has been a collaborative effort. And I appreciate all of the input that we got, because I think we can all be proud of the steps that Massachusetts is poised to take, and it will continue us as a industry leader.
I'm glad you mentioned the staff, because I also appreciate the staff. Caleb, Doreen, James, the whole 9 yards. They're fabulous. So a couple of other questions that came in, barriers and challenges. We hear about supply chain issues during the pandemic. We hear about the need for specialized boats to help build and construct offshore wind facilities. We hear about turbines being constructed, and there's, with all the work that's being done at the federal and state scales, there's going to be a fourfold increase in demand for construction and materials. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you all did in the report, or how the bill addresses some of those supply chain challenges?
Well, so one of my other hats that I wear in the legislature is the chair of the Manufacturing Caucus. And I think you highlighted that in your introduction. And our mission there is to promote making it in Massachusetts. And when I say that, we develop a lot of great ideas here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have some of the greatest research universities. I believe you are at one of them. And there's great work being done. If we can design it and develop it here, then we certainly can make it here. And making it here is really how we can address the supply chain issues. And one of the topics that we talked about in the prior meeting with NECDC was regionalizing our supply chain. You know, one state can manufacture one element and another state can manufacture another element. And I had talked about, hey, if you have a manufacturer up in New Hampshire, well, they're going to use consultants from UMass Lowell. They're going to use the Teamsters. They're going to use, any number of a steel fabricator from Lowell. There are opportunities for us to develop a supply chain in our region. And I think that's important. I will jump a little off topic in talking about a company that does address the supply chain when it comes to lithium ion batteries. It's a company called 6K out of Andover, and they have developed a process to recycle lithium ion batteries. If right now, all lithium ion batteries are manufactured in China. None are made in the United States of America. And that's bad for the future. That's bad for our policy. But if they're able to recycle those batteries and generate new batteries, do you realize what a game changer that is? And those are the types of efforts that we need to continue to promote in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to build our supply chain. Right now the blades are being manufactured over in France. Let's see if we can't do some of that work here in the United States. We have a great blade testing facility over in Charlestown. Let's build on that. We have plenty of space to do this work in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I, like so many of my other colleagues, will continue looking for ways that we can build our supply chain right here so that we don't run into these hurdles as we move forward. You pointed it out. There are great opportunities out there. And I think the latest bid that came in for offshore wind includes a cable manufacturing firm down in Somerset. Imagine the transformational impact of taking the land once occupied by a coal burning facility and replacing it with a manufacturer of cabling that's going to be used to transmit power from our turbines to our plugs in our home. It's just incredible opportunities. And it's a once in a lifetime opportunity for Massachusetts to take advantage of this. And I know the speaker will do everything in his power to see that we do it right and make Massachusetts the industry leader in offshore wind.
That's fabulous. Thank you for that. That makes so much sense. The environment and the economy can work hand in hand. So one of the couple of questions came in about the context of Massachusetts. What makes us unique? What is the definition of technical offshore wind potential, and what makes us as a region, the geography, the wind, the connection to populations on the coast? Can you speak about the potential of, you mentioned we're the Saudi Arabia of wind. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and if you don't like the Saudi Arabia analogy, you could say what oil did for Texas, wind will do for Massachusetts. I'll take whatever analogy you'd like to use. But so take into consideration that Massachusetts has incredible innovators. We have We have the MITs, the Worcester Polytechs, the UMass Lowells. We have an offshore wind energy center out at UMass Amherst. I know there's not a lot of ocean out there in Amherst, but they have a very highly skilled offshore wind faculty and research facility. Having the innovators gives you an incredible advantage. In addition, we have the best skilled workforce in the entire United States. We have the highest number of residents with post-secondary degrees in the entire United States. So we have a skilled workforce. Granted, we need to develop additional skills, but you put those two pieces together, also with our geographical location, 14 miles off the coast of our state is the most robust wind in the contiguous United States. That I will refer to as the constellation of the stars. And you have a legislature that understands this, wants to continue growth in this area, and pardon the pun, but has the energy to get this done. I think it's just an incredible opportunity, and that's what really makes Massachusetts well poised and well positioned to be a leader in this industry. And it's no small small step that the first large-scale offshore wind project is on the shores of Massachusetts. And we're very proud of that. And we want to see many more. I told the folks at New Bedford, if I can come down here once a month for a groundbreaking of some sort, nothing would make me happier.
That's fabulous. One final question on environmental impacts. Excuse me. So we talked about Massachusetts being unique. We're unique for our fisheries. We have almost an $11 billion fishing industry in Massachusetts. We have Cape Cod, which is a great tourist attraction. And we have amazing habitat. The Commonwealth has done such a great job, and the legislature's been so supportive of helping restore our coastal areas and our marine areas. And we have the right whales too, the endangered mammals. So I know you talked a bit about the environmental impacts and how the bill considers that. But when you spoke about speaking with the consulate from England, can you speak just a little bit about how they manage some of those impacts?
Well, first of all, they developed a very robust management plan. I thought my wind report at 100 pages was extensive, but their fisheries mitigation plan really goes into depth. I mean, we copied some of the ideas from that fisheries mitigation plan, and I don't take any shame in looking at best practices and seeing how it works in other places and incorporating them into what we do. That's what this business is all about. See what works and incorporate it. So many of the ideas that you see incorporated into our legislation is what England and Europe has been doing for 30 years. They have a great partnership with their fishermen, and I want to see Massachusetts have a great, relationship with its fisheries. And when you talked about the whales, you reminded me of a very great story in my early life. In 1986, I had been studying for the bar exam, and I was absolutely frazzled. And it was a dear friend of mine who said, "Jeff, the day before the exam, you're not going to do any studying. I'm picking you up, and we're going to go on a whale watch." And I remember that my day going out off of Plymouth and seeing whales. And boy, did that just relax me and calm me down and get me ready for that bar exam. I'll never forget it.
That's fabulous. What a great note to wrap up on. I totally hear you on connecting with nature and getting outside. And I just want to thank you very, very much for joining us today. You really hit a home run. You hit the ball out of the park, providing some great information for folks and everyone who tuned in here. And so I just want to thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your interest, and thank you for your contributions to making Massachusetts a great place to live, work, and raise a family. We couldn't do it without you, and I hope that this is the first of many conversations we'll have.
Absolutely. That sounds great, Chairman Roy. I really, really appreciate it. And I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. We appreciate your support for the Nature Conservancy, and it's what makes this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to resources and the legislation. I think it's up on the floor next week, right?
Not next week, but hopefully soon. And if people would like to see the report that we did, certainly we'll make that available as well.
Fabulous. We'd be happy to share that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll also have a recording of the webinar. And just for the audience, if you're enjoying our webinars, please share it with your friends. You can also follow us on social media, and check us out on Facebook, on Instagram, and you can keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And as always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign on at nature.org/MA-webinars. Thank you again for joining us, audience, and thank you again, Chairman Roy. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. Take care.